I had just gotten off a delayed flight from Phoenix to Albuquerque that Thursday night in March of 2019, completely exhausted from a week of client presentations that had gone longer than expected. It was past 10 p.m. when I finally made it through baggage claim, and all I wanted was to collapse into my hotel bed downtown and forget about quarterly projections for at least 8 hours. I was 29 then, traveling constantly for my consulting job with Anderson Strategic Group, practically living out of rental cars and airport lounges. The rental counter was nearly deserted at that hour, with most staff already gone home and only one tired employee processing my reservation with mechanical efficiency. I remember the fluorescent lights humming overhead as I signed the paperwork for a silver Nissan Altima, declining the insurance coverage like I always did because my credit card supposedly covered it. The route from Albuquerque to my hotel should have been straightforward, but my phone's GPS kept recalculating, trying to route me around construction that had closed the main highway exit. Instead, it directed me onto Highway 550, which would take me north through a stretch of the Navajo Reservation before looping back toward the city. I had driven through reservation land before on other business trips, always during daylight, and never thought much about it beyond appreciating the stark beauty of the high desert landscape. But at night, with no moon and heavy cloud cover blocking the stars, it was like driving through an endless void, punctuated only by my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through absolute darkness. About 40 minutes into the drive, I needed gas desperately. The gauge had been reading just under a quarter tank when I picked up the rental, and I had stupidly assumed I would find a station before getting this far out. A small independent gas station finally appeared on my right, the kind of place that probably hadn't been renovated since the 1980s, with 2 pumps under a flickering canopy light and a small attached convenience store that looked closed despite a dim light visible inside. I pulled up to the pump, killed the engine, and stepped out into air that was shockingly cold for March, probably hovering around 35 degrees, with a wind that cut straight through my business casual button-down shirt. The pump's card reader was taped over, with a handwritten sign directing customers to pay inside first, so I locked the car and walked toward the building, my dress shoes crunching on gravel mixed with broken glass. Through the window, I could see someone behind the counter, an older man with long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, watching a small television that cast flickering blue light across his weathered face. The door stuck when I tried to open it, swollen from moisture or age, and when it finally gave way, a bell above jingled loudly in the silent night. The man looked up at me with dark eyes that seemed to assess me in a single glance before returning his attention to the television without greeting. I told him I needed $40 on pump 2, and he nodded slowly, taking my credit card with hands that had deep lines etched into the palms like canyon systems. While he processed the payment with an ancient card reader that made loud mechanical chunking sounds, I glanced around the store. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans of soup, bags of chips with expiration dates I could not quite read in the dim light, and a cooler in the back that hummed loudly but inconsistently. That is when I noticed someone standing outside just beyond the edge of the parking lot lights, at the border where the illumination gave way to complete darkness. At first, I thought it might be another customer waiting to use the pump, but something about the figure's complete stillness made my skin prickle with instinctive unease. The old man handed back my credit card and said, in a low, gravelly voice that carried an accent I could not quite place, "Pump is on. You drive straight through tonight. No stopping. No picking up anyone on the road. You understand?" His tone was not unkind, but carried an unmistakable weight of warning that made me pause with my hand on the door. I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, as he said, "Just drive through. Get to where you're going." When I looked back toward the window, the figure I had seen at the edge of the darkness was gone, leaving me wondering if exhaustion was making me imagine things. I filled the tank quickly, my hands fumbling with the nozzle because I kept glancing around the empty lot, feeling watched from the darkness beyond the lights. The pump clicked off at $42, and I decided not to go back inside for the $2 difference. I just wanted to get back on the road, back to civilization, back to the well-lit safety of my hotel room. I pulled out of the station perhaps faster than necessary, my tires spitting gravel as I merged back onto Highway 550, the gas station's lights disappearing behind me within seconds as the darkness swallowed everything in my rearview mirror. The first 10 miles were uneventful, just me in the center line and the occasional reflective mile marker catching my headlights. The radio cycled through static and brief snatches of Navajo language programming that faded in and out, so I switched it off entirely, preferring silence to the unsettling feeling of hearing voices that disappeared before I could understand them. That is when I noticed something moving in the scrubland to my right, parallel to the car, keeping pace despite my speed of 65 miles per hour. At first, I convinced myself it was just an optical illusion, shadows cast by my headlights playing tricks in my peripheral vision. But then I saw it more clearly as it crossed a bare patch of desert, a shape that looked like a large animal, possibly a coyote or wolf, running at an impossible speed through terrain that should have slowed anything down with its rocks and uneven ground. I pressed the accelerator, bringing my speed up to 75, thinking whatever it was would fall behind. Instead, it kept pace effortlessly, and as I watched it in the brief moments my headlights swept across that stretch of desert, I realized with growing horror that it was not maintaining a four-legged gait consistently. Sometimes it appeared to be running on all fours, like any canine would, but then it would rear up and run on its hind legs for several strides before dropping back down, all while maintaining that unnatural speed that matched my car exactly. My hands were starting to sweat on the steering wheel, and my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it pulsing in my neck. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a deer running from my car's lights, and the strange movement was just the result of uneven ground making it appear to shift between gates. Maybe the darkness and my exhaustion were making me misinterpret what was actually just a normal desert animal. But then the thing crossed the road directly in front of me, and I slammed on the brakes so hard the anti-lock system engaged with that rapid thumping vibration through the pedal. In the full brightness of my headlights, for maybe 3 seconds, I saw it clearly. It stood upright on two legs like a human would stand, but its proportions were wrong. The legs bent backward at the knee joint like a dog's hind legs, and the arms were too long, hanging down past where knees would be on a normal person. What made my stomach drop with primal terror was the head. It had the skull of a coyote, or at least something that looked like a coyote, with a long snout full of visible teeth, but the skull was mounted on a neck that bent and moved with human flexibility. The whole thing was covered in patchy fur that looked mangy and diseased, with bare patches showing grayish skin underneath. It wore what appeared to be tattered remnants of human clothing, a filthy flannel shirt that hung open, and jeans that were ripped and caked with mud or something darker. But the worst part, the detail that has stayed with me every night since then, was the eyes. They were not animal eyes with that flat, instinctive gaze. They had human intelligence behind them, calculating and aware, and they reflected my headlights with a yellow-green glow that did not look natural. For those 3 seconds, we stared at each other through my windshield, and I swear on everything I value that thing smiled at me. Its snout pulled back in an expression that was impossible for that skull structure to make naturally, showing too many teeth in a grin that held nothing but malicious intent. Then it opened its mouth impossibly wide, wider than any jaw should hinge, and made a sound that I can only describe as a combination of a coyote's yipping and human laughter, high-pitched and mocking. Before I could process what I was seeing, it dropped to all fours and began running directly toward my car with a speed that defied physics. I made a decision in that split second that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to turn around or pulling off the road, I floored the accelerator straight at it, figuring if this thing was real and not some hallucination, I would rather hit it than let it reach my door. The Altima's engine screamed as I pushed it past 80, then 90, then 100 miles per hour, the speedometer needle climbing into territory I had never driven before on public roads. The thing chased me, keeping pace for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 miles. It would run alongside my driver's side window, sometimes on 4 legs, but sometimes upright on 2, peering in at me with those horrible, intelligent eyes, while making that hybrid, yipping laughing sound that I could hear even over my engine and the wind noise. Several times it reached out with one of those 2 long arms and dragged claws across my door, leaving marks I would later find gouged into the metal like something had taken a box cutter to it in long, deliberate scratches. It tapped on my window with what looked like human fingers, but ended in thick, yellowed claws, and each tap made a sound like knuckles on glass, except louder, harder, like it was striking with bone instead of flesh. I was screaming by that point, not words, just incoherent sounds of pure terror, while my rational mind tried and failed to make sense of what was happening. Every horror movie I had ever seen, every monster story I had dismissed as fiction, suddenly felt like inadequate preparation for the reality of being hunted by something that should not exist. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped chasing me. I noticed its absence first in my peripheral vision, where its shape had been a constant presence for those terrifying miles. When I risked a glance in my rearview mirror, I saw it standing in the middle of the road behind me, silhouetted against the darkness. Watching my car disappear into the distance, I kept my speed above 90 for another 10 miles until I saw a sign that said I was leaving the Navajo Nation and entering Sandoval County. Only then did I let my foot ease slightly on the accelerator, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and fear as the reality of what I had just experienced started to sink into my shock-numbed brain. I made it to Albuquerque, running on pure autopilot, my conscious mind unable to focus on anything except replaying those images over and over. The hotel check-in clerk asked if I was feeling all right, and I must have looked as traumatized as I felt because she offered to call a doctor. I told her I was fine, just tired from traveling, and took my room key with hands that were still trembling. Once inside my room on the 4th floor, I checked every lock 3 times, wedged the desk chair under the door handle, and pulled the curtains closed so tightly that not even a sliver of outside darkness could peek through. Sleep did not come that night. I sat in the bathroom with the light on and the door locked, researching on my phone with the single-minded desperation of someone trying to prove they were not losing their sanity. That is when I first encountered the word Skinwalker, discovered in forum posts and blog entries and Wikipedia articles that described exactly what I had seen. Navajo legends spoke of witches who wore animal skins to transform, who could run at impossible speeds, who had human intelligence in animal bodies, who were drawn to travelers on remote reservation roads at night. The old man at the gas station had known and tried to warn me in his indirect way, and I had been too tired and skeptical to understand. The next morning in full daylight, I forced myself to inspect my rental car in the hotel parking lot. The scratches were real, deep gouges in the silver paint that went down to bare metal in 4 parallel lines on the driver's side door, exactly where I remembered seeing those claws drag across the surface. There were also muddy handprints on the back window, smeared and dried overnight, with fingers that looked human-sized but with abnormally long proportions. I took photographs of everything with my phone, then spent an hour cleaning off the prints with wet wipes from my travel bag, not wanting to have to explain any of this to the rental company. I called the Anderson Strategic Group office and told them I was taking sick days, something I had never done in 4 years with the company. My manager was confused, but approved it without question after I claimed food poisoning, which was easier to explain than the truth that I could not bring myself to get back in that car and drive anywhere remotely isolated. I changed my return flight to leave from Albuquerque directly instead of driving back to Phoenix, eating the change fee without hesitation, because the thought of driving through that stretch of Highway 550 again made my chest tight with panic. The rental company tried to charge me for the door damage when I returned the car at the airport, claiming it looked like vandalism. I did not argue, just paid the deductible and signed their form without explaining what had actually caused it. How do you write "chased by Skinwalker" on an insurance claim and expect to be taken seriously? I returned to Phoenix by air, moved to a different position within my company that focused on local clients instead of requiring constant travel, and have not driven through the Southwest at night since that March evening in 2019. People who have not experienced something like this will think I imagined it. That exhaustion and darkness and an overactive imagination created a monster out of an ordinary coyote. I have had 6 years to convince myself of that explanation, to rationalize away what I saw as a stress-induced hallucination, but I still have the photographs of those scratches on my phone, still wake up sometimes to the memory of that thing's face peering at me through my car window, with human intelligence gleaming behind animal eyes. And I think about the gas station attendant's warning, about the knowledge in his eyes that suggested he had seen others come through with the same haunted look I must have had. Whatever ran alongside my car that night on Highway 550, it was not a coyote, not a hallucination, not something that science has cataloged and explained. It was something older, something that belongs to legends whispered among the Navajo, something that should stay in stories told around campfires, but sometimes crosses into our world when travelers like me are foolish enough to ignore the warnings and drive through its territory after dark. I'd been planning the Four Corners camping trip with my college roommate Sarah for nearly 6 months, coordinating our schedules around her nursing shifts and my teaching calendar until we finally found a week in late September of 2021 when we were both free. I was 34 then, teaching high school biology in Durango, Colorado, and desperately needing a break from lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences. Sarah and I had been camping together since our freshman year at Fort Lewis College, accumulating hundreds of miles on various trails throughout the Southwest. So when she suggested we explore some of the more remote areas near the Utah-Arizona border, where the Navajo reservation stretched across the high desert, I agreed without hesitation. We drove out from Durango on a Saturday morning in Sarah's Subaru Outback, both of us excited about 5 days away from civilization with nothing but our tent, camping gear, and a carefully planned route that would take us through some of the most stunning and isolated landscape in the American Southwest. The drive itself was beautiful. 2-lane highways cutting through red rock formations and vast expanses of sagebrush and juniper that stretched to horizons so distant they seemed to curve with the earth. We stopped in Cortez for last-minute supplies, then continued south into the reservation, following increasingly rough dirt roads that tested even Sarah's all-wheel drive as we bounced over washboard surfaces and dodged rocks that could puncture a tire. Our destination was a site Sarah had found through some obscure camping forum, described as a perfect dispersed camping location near an abandoned hogan about 15 miles off the main highway. The forum post included GPS coordinates and several photos showing a sheltered area with views of Monument Valley in the distance, promising incredible sunset photography and total solitude. What the post did not mention, and what we did not discover until we arrived in the late afternoon, was that the hogan was not just abandoned, but felt fundamentally wrong in a way I could not articulate at first. The traditional Navajo dwelling sat about 200 yards from where we planned to pitch our tent, its log and mud construction partially collapsed on one side but still recognizable in its octagonal shape. The doorway faced east according to tradition, but someone had spray-painted symbols around the entrance that I did not recognize, crude markings in faded red paint that had weathered and run down the mud walls in streaks. Sarah wanted to explore it before setting up camp, her curiosity as a history enthusiast overriding any sense of unease. but I convinced her we should establish our campsite first while we still had good light. We were hammering in the last tent stake when an older Navajo man appeared seemingly from nowhere, walking toward us from the direction of the hogan with a walking stick that clicked rhythmically against rocks as he approached. He wore traditional clothing with a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, and when he got close enough for me to see his expression clearly, I noticed his eyes held a mixture of concern and something that looked like resignation. He asked us in slightly accented English if we knew where we were camping, and Sarah cheerfully explained about the form recommendation and how excited we were to explore the area. The man's face darkened, and he shook his head slowly, telling us that the hogan was abandoned for very specific reasons, that no one from the nearby communities would come near this place after sunset, and that we should pack up immediately and find somewhere else to camp. Sarah asked why, thinking it might be a sacred site we were inadvertently disrespecting, but the man would not elaborate. He just repeated his warning, said that some places were left empty because they belonged to things that walked at night, and then turned and walked away before we could ask more questions. We watched him disappear over a rise in the landscape, and Sarah looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes. We should have listened. Every rational part of my brain that had kept me safe through years of backcountry camping was screaming that we should pack up and leave. But Sarah argued that we had driven 4 hours to get here, that one superstitious local should not dictate our entire trip, and that it was almost sunset anyway, so driving out on those rough roads in darkness would be more dangerous than spending one night and reassessing in the morning. I let myself be convinced, though I insisted we move our tent farther from the hogan, positioning ourselves at least 400 yards away on a small rise that gave us a clear view of the surrounding area. The sunset was spectacular, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that made the distant mesas look like they were glowing from within. We cooked a simple dinner of freeze-dried camping meals on our portable stove, talking about our route for the next few days, and trying to ignore the growing unease that had settled over our campsite like a physical presence. As full darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly in that high desert way, going from comfortable to cold enough that we could see our breath in the beam of our headlamps. That is when we first heard the footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, circling our tent in a wide radius that kept whoever or whatever was making them just outside the reach of our flashlight beams. Sarah grabbed her headlamp and swept it in a full circle around our campsite, illuminating nothing but empty desert and the distant silhouette of the hogan against the star-filled sky. The footsteps stopped when the light passed over their location, then resumed once we turned the beam away, maintaining that same circular pattern that felt less like random wandering and more like deliberate reconnaissance. I called out, asking if anyone was there, if they needed help, but received no response except the continued sound of footsteps on rocky ground. We sat in our tent with every flashlight we had pointed outward, trying to convince ourselves it was just a curious animal, or perhaps even the old man from earlier checking to make sure we were all right. But animals do not walk in perfect circles, and the footsteps had a bipedal rhythm, heel-toe, that sounded distinctly human. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes, the footsteps stopped entirely, leaving us in silence so complete that I could hear Sarah's breathing and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That is when we heard the voices. My mother's voice, calling my name from somewhere out in the darkness, asking me to come help her because she was lost and scared. Sarah's father's voice, gruff and commanding in the way she had described it, telling her to come out of the tent right now and stop playing games. But my mother was 800 miles away in Oregon, and Sarah's father had been dead for 3 years, passed away from a heart attack in 2018 that had devastated her. We looked at each other in the dim red glow of our emergency lamp, both of us going pale as we realized something was using our family members' voices to try to lure us out of the tent. The voices continued for hours, cycling through different family members and friends, sometimes speaking English, and sometimes lapsing into what sounded like Navajo, though neither of us spoke the language. What made it more disturbing was the accuracy. When my voice called out to Sarah, it used an inside joke from our sophomore year that no one else would know. When her late father's voice spoke, it mentioned specific details about her childhood that she had shared with me during late-night conversations, but never posted publicly. Whatever was out there had access to information it should not have, was using our own memories and relationships as weapons to exploit our emotions and trick us into vulnerability. Around 2 a.m., the voices stopped, and we heard something else. The sound of bones cracking and popping, like someone going through a series of impossible contortions, joints bending in ways that human joints should not bend. The sound was wet and organic, accompanied by what could only be described as flesh stretching and tearing. Sarah was crying silently, her hand gripping mine so tightly that I lost feeling in my fingers. Both of us frozen in terror as we listened to whatever transformation was happening just outside our tent walls. Then we saw the shadow. The moon had risen, nearly full and bright enough to cast distinct shadows, and against the thin nylon of our tent wall, we saw a silhouette that made no anatomical sense. The head was too large and shaped wrong, bulging in places that human heads do not bulge. The arms were too long, hanging down to where the knees should be, and when it moved, the proportions shifted as if the skeleton underneath was not fixed in place. It crouched down beside our tent, and we watched in horror as it pressed what looked like a hand against the fabric, leaving an imprint that showed 6 fingers instead of 5, each one ending in something pointed that pushed the nylon inward without puncturing it. Sarah grabbed her phone and turned on the camera, shining the light toward where the shadow figure was crouched. And for just an instant, we saw it through the translucent tent fabric. It had the rough shape of a human body but covered in patchy fur or hide, with a head that looked like a deer skull complete with antlers, mounted on a neck that bent at an angle no cervical spine should manage. The eyes, visible through the empty sockets of the skull, glowed with a greenish light that had no natural source. Then it scurried away on all fours, moving with a speed and gait that looked like a spider more than any mammal, disappearing into the darkness so quickly that we questioned whether we had actually seen it. We made a decision in that moment without needing to discuss it. We were leaving right then, regardless of how dangerous driving out in darkness might be. We scrambled to pack our essential gear, shoving our sleeping bags and tent and anything valuable into Sarah's Subaru with frantic speed, both of us watching the darkness around us for any sign of movement. The tent was abandoned, half collapsed where it stood. Our cooking gear and camp chairs were left scattered around the fire ring we had built but never used. We just threw everything we could carry into the car and climbed in, locking all the doors and starting the engine with hands that shook so badly that Sarah dropped her keys twice before getting them into the ignition. As we pulled away from our campsite, our headlights swept across the area where the Hogan stood, and what I saw made me grab Sarah's arm and point. There were figures surrounding the abandoned dwelling, at least 6 or 7 of them, standing in a circle around the collapsed structure. In the brief illumination of our headlights, I saw that each one had an animal head on a human body. One had the skull of a coyote, another wore what looked like a wolf's head, a third had the unmistakable rack of antlers and elongated skull of an elk. They stood perfectly still as our lights passed over them, their animal skulls all turning in unison to watch our vehicle. And I swear that I saw intelligence behind those empty eye sockets, awareness, and something that felt like amusement at our terror. One of them was wearing Sarah's fleece jacket, the bright purple Columbia pullover she had been wearing earlier in the day before it got too warm, and she had left it draped over a rock near our original campsite location. The thing wearing her jacket was the one with the coyote skull, and it raised one too long arm in a gesture that could have been a wave or a warning or a promise. Then we were past them, bouncing down the rough, dirt road at a speed that risked destroying Sarah's suspension, neither of us caring about anything except putting distance between ourselves and whatever gathering we had stumbled into. We drove for an hour before either of us could speak, making it back to the paved highway and then continuing north toward Cortez without stopping. When we finally pulled into a gas station under fluorescent lights that felt like salvation after the darkness of the desert, we sat in the parking lot and looked at each other with the shared understanding of people who had witnessed something that would change them permanently. Sarah's phone had captured nothing when we reviewed the video she had taken, just darkness and our own panicked breathing, as if the camera had refused to record what our eyes had seen. We reported nothing to authorities because what would we say? That we were chased away from our campsite by creatures from Navajo legend that should not exist outside of folklore. We drove back to Durango that night instead of completing our camping trip and spent the next few days at Sarah's apartment jumping at every unexpected sound and sleeping with all the lights on. A week later, we received a package at Sarah's address with no return label. Inside was her purple fleece jacket, neatly folded, with no note or explanation for how it had been returned, or how whoever sent it had known where to send it. The jacket smelled wrong, like animal musk and something sweet and rotten underneath, and Sarah threw it away without trying to clean it. We also found, tucked into one of the pockets, a single coyote tooth that looked yellowed with age, placed there deliberately as if someone was making a point about being able to find us even after we had fled their territory. I still have that tooth, kept in a sealed plastic bag at the back of my desk drawer, because throwing it away felt like it would invite something worse, and keeping it felt like acknowledging the reality of what we encountered. Sarah and I have not been camping together since that September in 2021. Though we remain close friends, we do not talk about that night very often, both of us preferring to let the memory fade into something that feels less immediate and terrifying. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night and hear footsteps outside my house, I have to force myself not to imagine what might be circling just beyond my porch light, wearing a face that does not belong to it, and speaking in voices stolen from people I love. The desert at night belongs to things older than our understanding, and some warnings from strangers should be heeded without question, no matter how rational we think we are or how well prepared our camping gear might be. I took the overnight security job at the telecommunications relay station in northern New Mexico because it paid almost double what I was making at the grocery store in Farmington. And at 23 years old, with student loans piling up from my 2 years at San Juan College, I needed every dollar I could get. The position was straightforward, according to the posting. Monitor the equipment, do perimeter checks every 2 hours, make sure nobody vandalized the satellite dishes or cell towers, and basically just exist as a human presence to deter copper thieves who had been hitting remote facilities across the Four Corners region. The station sat about 8 miles south of the Colorado border on a flat stretch of high desert that technically belonged to the Bureau of Land Management, but bordered Navajo Nation land on 3 sides. It consisted of a small cinder block guard shack with a kitchenette and bathroom, 3 massive satellite dishes mounted on concrete pads, 2 cell towers that rose 200 feet into the sky, and a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that enclosed about 5 acres of scrubland. The whole property was lit by sodium vapor lights that turned everything an eerie orange color and hummed constantly with that electrical buzz that eventually became background noise you stop noticing. My shift ran from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., 5 nights a week, Wednesday through Sunday. The company that contracted my security firm, Southwest Communications Management, provided me with a flashlight, pepper spray, and a 2-way radio to call the local sheriff if I encountered any problems. No firearm, which the training supervisor said was company policy to avoid liability issues. I remember thinking that seemed stupid for a position that involved being alone in the middle of nowhere all night, but I needed the job too badly to argue about it. The first week was boring in the way night security jobs usually are. Long stretches of absolutely nothing happening, punctuated by walks around the perimeter, where I would check gates and shine my flashlight at shadows that always turned out to be tumbleweeds or jackrabbits. I brought textbooks to study for the classes I was still taking online, and spent most of my shifts reading about network security protocols and drinking terrible coffee from the ancient machine in the guard shack. The only unusual thing was how often the motion sensors along the western fence line would trigger, setting off an alarm that I would have to acknowledge and then investigate. The motion sensors were part of a security system installed before I was hired. Infrared beams that would detect anything larger than a coyote crossing their path and send an alert to my computer terminal. The western fence line had 6 sensors, spaced about 100 feet apart, covering the section of perimeter that faced directly toward the reservation boundary. During my first week, they triggered maybe twice per shift, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I would dutifully pull up the corresponding camera feeds to see what had set them off. The cameras never showed anything except empty desert and the fence line illuminated by those orange lights. No animals, no people, nothing that should have broken the infrared beam. I reported the false alarms to my supervisor during my Friday morning checkout call, and he said the system had been glitchy lately, probably dust or temperature fluctuations affecting the sensors, and that a technician would come out eventually to recalibrate them. Until then, I should keep logging the alerts, but not worry too much about investigating every single one, since it was probably nothing. That advice seemed reasonable enough at the time, and I spent my second week mostly ignoring the western fence sensors when they triggered, only checking the cameras occasionally and always seeing nothing. It was during my third week, on a Thursday night in late October of 2022, that I decided to do a physical patrol of the western fence instead of just relying on the cameras. The sensors had triggered 4 times between midnight and 2 a.m., which seemed excessive even for a faulty system, and I was getting tired of the alarm sound interrupting my studying. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight, clipped the radio to my belt, and headed out of the guard shack into the cold desert night with my breath fogging in the beam of my headlamp. The walk to the western fence took about 5 minutes, following a gravel path that wound between the satellite dishes and past the junction boxes that controlled the power distribution. The whole facility was bathed in that orange sodium light that made everything look slightly unreal, like I was walking through a film negative. When I reached the fence line, I started at the southernmost sensor and worked my way north, examining each post and checking for damage or signs of animal activity that might explain the false alarms. At the 4th sensor post, I found something that made me stop and crouch down for a closer look. The chain link fence was bent outward from the inside, pushed hard enough that the metal links had stretched and deformed into a bulge about 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. The ground on the interior side of the fence showed disturbance, rocks pushed aside and dirt scraped in a pattern that suggested something had been pressing against the fence with considerable force. What disturbed me more was that the damage was on the inside, as if something had been trying to push through the fence from within the facility rather than break in from outside. I radioed my supervisor on the emergency line, knowing I would probably wake him up, but figuring bent fencing qualified as something that needed immediate attention. He answered on the 5th ring, groggy and irritated, and listened to my description before telling me to take photos with my phone, document the location, and write up a detailed incident report that he would review in the morning. He said it was probably elk or deer that had gotten inside somehow and panicked when they could not find their way out, that it happened occasionally at remote facilities. His explanation made sense, except for one detail I did not mention over the radio because I was not sure what to make of it myself. Caught on the chain link where the fence was bent, stuck in the twisted metal like evidence left at a crime scene, were tufts of coarse fur that looked canine but too long to be from a coyote or domestic dog. Mixed with the fur were what appeared to be scraps of fabric, shredded pieces of denim and flannel that looked like they had been torn from clothing. I pulled out my phone and took several close-up photos of the fur and fabric before bagging a few samples in a Ziploc bag from my lunch kit, thinking maybe a homeless person had tried to camp inside the facility and their dog had freaked out. It was a weak explanation, but at 3 a.m., with adrenaline making my hands shake, I was willing to accept any rational interpretation rather than admit how wrong the scene felt. I returned to the guard shack and wrote up the incident report, attaching the photos and marking the fence damage location on the facility map. The rest of that shift passed without incident, and I left at 6 a.m., feeling tired and unsettled, but convincing myself that daylight would make everything seem less ominous. My next scheduled shift was Friday night, and I spent all day Friday trying to decide whether to call in sick or just push through my unease and show up like normal. The paycheck won that internal debate, and I drove out to the station Friday evening, telling myself that whatever had damaged the fence was long gone. Friday night started normally enough. I did my first perimeter check at midnight without finding anything unusual, though I noticed the western fence damage had not been repaired yet. The motion sensors had been quiet, not triggering once during the first 4 hours of my shift, which I took as a good sign that maybe the issue had resolved itself. I was making coffee in the guard shack kitchenette around 2:30 a.m. when all 6 western fence motion sensors triggered simultaneously, setting off an alarm that was louder and more urgent when multiple sensors went off at once. I pulled up the camera feeds on my terminal, switching through all 6 angles that covered the western perimeter, but once again saw absolutely nothing except fence line and empty desert. The sensors stayed triggered for almost 5 minutes, which had never happened before, and then reset themselves all at once, as if whatever had set them off had moved away in synchronized fashion. I was staring at the monitors, trying to make sense of it, when I heard something that made my blood turn cold. Footsteps on the gravel outside the guard shack, heavy boots, the unmistakable crunch, crunch, crunch of someone walking deliberately toward my door. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the door, shining the beam out into the sodium-lit facility, calling out to ask who was there and whether they needed assistance. The footsteps stopped immediately when I opened the door, but I saw nobody. The gravel path that led to my shack showed no one. The spaces between buildings were empty, and the whole facility looked exactly as it should, except for the complete absence of whoever or whatever had just been walking toward my door. I stepped outside and did a full 360-degree sweep with my flashlight, checking behind the satellite dishes and around the corners of the equipment buildings, finding nothing and nobody. My radio was clipped to my belt, and I keyed it to call my supervisor again, but before I could speak, I heard the footsteps resume. They were behind me now, coming from the direction I had just checked, the sound perfectly clear and distinct in the cold night air. I spun around with my flashlight and saw nothing, just my own shadow stretched long across the gravel by the sodium lights. Then I saw him standing by the guard shack door, the door I had just exited maybe 30 seconds earlier. He was wearing my security uniform, the exact same gray shirt with the Southwest security patch on the shoulder, and the black cargo pants that were part of my issued gear. He had my build, my height, even what looked like my posture, in the way he stood with his weight shifted slightly to the left like I do because of an old knee injury. The distance between us was maybe 40 feet, far enough that I could not see his face clearly in the orange light. And for a split second, my brain tried to convince me I was looking at my own reflection, somehow impossibly projected into space. He turned his head toward me with a movement that was too smooth, neck rotating further than human anatomy should allow, and I saw his face. It looked like my face, same nose and same jaw and same hairline, but the expression was completely wrong. The mouth was stretched too wide in something that resembled a smile but showed too many teeth, and the eyes did not blink, just stared at me with a flat intensity that had nothing human behind it. Then he dropped to all fours with a movement so fast and fluid that it looked like stop-motion animation. his spine bending in ways that would have shattered a normal vertebral column, and he scuttled away into the darkness between buildings, moving like a spider or a crab, limbs articulating at wrong angles. I was screaming into my radio for help, for someone to get out here immediately, for the sheriff, or my supervisor, or anyone who could witness what I was seeing and confirm I was not losing my mind. My supervisor came on the line demanding to know what was wrong, and I tried to explain through gasps and stuttered words that something was wearing my face. Something was inside the facility that should not be here. He said he was calling the local sheriff's station and that I should lock myself in the guard shack until a deputy arrived, which I did without hesitation, barricading the door with my chair and standing with my back against the wall where I could see all the windows. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived about 25 minutes later, which felt like 6 hours, and I watched their patrol car pull through the front gate with a relief so intense my knees went weak. They were professional and thorough, checking my eyes for signs of intoxication and asking detailed questions about what I had seen, while also conducting a search of the facility with weapons drawn and flashlights sweeping every corner. They found my security uniform hanging on the western fence line, the exact shirt and pants I was currently wearing, neatly draped over the chain link where it had been damaged days earlier. The impossible part, the detail that made one deputy pull out his phone and start taking photos while the other deputy stood silently staring at me, was that the uniform on the fence had my name badge still attached and my radio still clipped to the belt. I looked down at my own shirt and saw my name badge right where it should be, looked at my belt and felt the weight of my radio right where I had clipped it. Whatever had been wearing a duplicate of my uniform had left it behind as evidence or warning or proof that I had not hallucinated the whole encounter. I quit that night, refused to stay for the rest of my shift, even when my supervisor arrived and tried to convince me that it was just an elaborate prank by coworkers or maybe trespassers trying to scare me. The company tried to dock my final paycheck for abandoning my post, but backed down when I mentioned I had photos of everything and was considering talking to the local news about security issues at their facilities. I learned later, through a friend who still worked for the same security company, that they had gone through 12 guards at that telecommunications station in the previous 18 months, all of them quitting suddenly with vague complaints about feeling watched or hearing things or encountering unexplainable situations. The station now operates with 2-person teams on night shifts, though the company officially claims that is for improved security coverage rather than admitting that nobody will work there alone anymore. I moved back to Farmington and took a job at a hardware store that paid less but operated during daylight hours only, and I have never worked overnight security again. Whatever walks the desert between those satellite dishes and cell towers after dark, whatever has learned to wear human faces and human clothes, I want nothing more to do with it. Some jobs are not worth the paycheck, no matter how desperate you are for money or how rational you think you are about superstition and legends. The Navajo were right to leave some places empty after sunset. I took the substitute bus driver position with Chinle School District in early September of 2020 because substitute teaching was not bringing in enough money to cover my rent, and the district was desperate enough for drivers that they offered to pay for my commercial license training. I was 26 and had moved to Arizona 6 months earlier for a teaching job that fell through when the pandemic hit, leaving me scrambling for any work I could find in the small communities scattered across the Navajo reservation. The bus route I was covering ran through some of the most remote areas of the reservation, picking up students from homes that were sometimes miles apart along dirt roads that barely qualified as roads at all. The regular driver, a woman named Betty, who had been driving the route for 15 years, had quit suddenly with no explanation beyond a terse resignation letter that the transportation supervisor mentioned only in passing. He seemed uncomfortable when I asked why she left, just said something about personal reasons, and handed me the route sheet with pickup times and addresses. The route covered 87 miles total, starting at 6 a.m. and making 12 stops before arriving at the middle school by 8:15, then reversing the whole thing in the afternoon. Most of the students were quiet, polite kids who kept to themselves, but the supervisor gave me one specific instruction that seemed odd at the time. Do not stop for anyone who is not on the official pickup list, no matter what, even if they claim to be a student or parent who needs help. My first week went smoothly enough. I learned the route, memorized the faces of the kids at each stop, and got used to the long stretches of driving through landscape that looked like Mars, all red rock, and scrubland with occasional hogans visible in the distance. The students ranged from 6th to 8th grade, and most of them had earbuds in or were reading on their phones during the drive. Typical middle school behavior that required little management from me. The isolation was actually peaceful in a way. Just me and the road and the sound of the diesel engine as we wound through the high desert in the pre-dawn darkness. It was on my second week, Wednesday morning, that I first noticed the woman. She was standing at the second stop on my route, about 8 miles north of Chinle proper, where I normally picked up 2 sisters named Yazzie. The woman looked elderly, maybe in her 70s, wearing a traditional velvet blouse and a long skirt in the Navajo style. She was waving at me as I approached, and my first instinct was to stop because she looked like she might need help. But I remembered the supervisor's warning and kept going after the Yazzie sisters boarded, watching the old woman in my mirror as she stood there waving until I turned a corner and lost sight of her. The strange part was that 15 miles later, at my 4th stop, where I picked up 3 boys from the Begay family, the same woman was standing there. Same velvet blouse, same long skirt, same waving gesture. I stared at her through the windshield while the boys climbed aboard, trying to figure out how she could have gotten ahead of me when I had been driving the only road that connected those stops. One of the Begay boys, a quiet 8th grader named Thomas, noticed me looking and said very softly, "Do not stop for her, just drive." His tone carried a weight that made me follow his advice without question. At my 6th stop, 22 miles from where I had last seen her, the woman was there again. This time, I got a better look at her face as I pulled up, and something was wrong with her eyes. They were too pale, almost white, with no visible iris or pupil, just blank discs that tracked my bus as it approached. The student at that stop, a girl named Claire, climbed on quickly and immediately said, "She's here today." The other students who were already on the bus went completely silent, all of them staring straight ahead and refusing to look out the windows at the woman who was still waving with mechanical persistence. I asked Claire what she meant, who that woman was, and she just shook her head and said her grandmother told her never to speak about it on the bus, that talking about it could make it follow you home. The rest of the drive to school was silent except for the engine noise, all the usual middle school chatter completely absent. And when I pulled into the school parking lot, the students got off faster than usual, practically running toward the building without their typical complaints about homework or tests. I reported what I had seen to the transportation supervisor during my afternoon check-in, describing the elderly woman and asking if there was a homeless person walking the route who might need welfare services. His face went pale and he asked me very specifically whether I had stopped the bus or opened the door when I saw her. When I said no, he visibly relaxed and told me I had done the right thing. He would not explain anything more except to say that Betty, the previous driver, had made the mistake of stopping during her last week, and that whatever happened had traumatized her badly enough that she refused to drive anymore, let alone discuss it. Thursday morning, I was dreading the route, but needed the money too badly to quit. The woman appeared at 4 different stops that day, always the same distance ahead of me no matter how fast or slow I drove between pickups. At the 3rd appearance, I noticed something that made my hands grip the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. She was standing in exactly the same position at each stop, right arm raised in the same waving gesture, left arm hanging at her side, weight balanced on her left foot. The pose was identical every time, like someone had copied and pasted her into different locations without bothering to change her position. On Friday morning, the situation escalated. I was approaching my 5th stop, a lonely spot where the road curved around a rock formation and a single student named Marcus waited each day, when I saw a child standing in the road about 200 yards ahead. Not at the stop, but in the middle of the road, flagging me down the way someone would if they needed emergency help. I slowed the bus instinctively, my training and basic human decency telling me to stop and check if the child was hurt or in danger. But as I got closer, I realized something was terribly wrong with the child's appearance. The clothing was old-fashioned, like something from photographs taken in the 1950s, a plaid dress that hung shapelessly, and shoes that looked more like slippers. The child's skin was too pale for this region, an unnatural white that seemed to glow slightly in my headlights. And the walk was wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by someone who did not quite understand human movement. The child was looking directly at me with a blank expression. No fear or confusion or any emotion at all, just emptiness behind eyes that might have been black or might have been hollow. Marcus, the student whose stop this was, came running from his house shouting at me not to stop, not to open the door. He was waving his arms and yelling in Navajo, words I did not understand, but tone that was unmistakably desperate. I slammed on the brakes but kept the door closed, watching as the child thing in the road stopped walking and just stood there, 10 feet from my front bumper, staring at me through the windshield. Marcus ran around the front of the bus, giving the child a wide berth, and pounded on the door until I opened it and let him scramble up the stairs. Drive now," he said, and I did not need to be told twice. I put the bus in gear and started to pull around the child, who turned to watch us pass. As I went by, the child's face began to change. The features aged rapidly, shifting from maybe 10 years old to 20 to 50 in the span of seconds, the skin wrinkling and sagging, and then smoothing out again in a cycle that defied biology. The mouth opened wider than any human mouth should open, revealing teeth that looked wrong. Too many of them, or shaped incorrectly, I could not tell which, because I was focused on getting past and getting away. In my rearview mirror, I watched it stand in the road, still as a statue, until we rounded the curve and I lost sight of it. Marcus was breathing hard, his hands shaking, and several other students had pulled out their phones and were texting or calling people, presumably family members, to tell them what had happened. One girl was crying quietly, and a boy near the back was whispering what sounded like a prayer in Navajo. Nobody asked me to stop for their usual morning snacks at the trading post. Nobody complained about being cold because the heater was not working great. They just wanted to get to school to get somewhere with lots of people and adults and safety in numbers. I called the transportation supervisor from the school parking lot and told him everything. Told him I could not drive that route again. Told him whatever Betty had experienced was now happening to me, and I was not equipped to handle it. He said he would find someone else to cover the route and suggested I take the rest of the week off with pay while they figured out a solution. I learned later that they had trouble finding any replacement driver willing to take that specific route, that several substitutes had tried it and quit after 1 or 2 runs with similar stories about seeing things that should not be there. The tribal police told me unofficially, through a friend who worked dispatch, that they got reports every few years about that stretch of road, about something that appeared to travelers and tried to get them to stop. They called it by a Navajo word I cannot spell or pronounce, but my friend translated it roughly as the one who wears faces, or the one who steals shapes. The advice was always the same. Never stop, never open your door, never acknowledge that you see it, because acknowledgement gives it power and permission to follow you. I moved back to Phoenix the following month and got a job teaching virtually from my apartment, done with rural Arizona and done with work that required me to drive alone through isolated areas before sunrise. The students from that route still show up in my dreams sometimes, their faces pressed against the bus windows, while something that looks almost human stands outside waving at me to stop. I wake up grateful that I listened to the warnings, grateful that I never opened that door, and terrified for whoever eventually took that route after me and whether they were told enough to keep them safe. I needed work badly enough in the summer of 2018 that when I saw the posting for a ranch hand position near Shiprock, New Mexico, I applied without asking too many questions about why they were hiring in the middle of cattle season when most ranches already had their crews set for the year. I was 30 years old, recently divorced, and living in my truck after losing my apartment in Farmington to back rent I could not pay. The ranch owner, a man named Castellano, who said he had operated cattle operations on the edge of Navajo land for 20 years, offered me $800 a week, plus a trailer to live in, and meals if I could start immediately. I said yes before he finished explaining the job details. The ranch covered about 3,000 acres of high desert grazing land that bordered the reservation on two sides, with a main house, several outbuildings, and a small trailer park where seasonal workers stayed during calving and roundup seasons. Castellano ran about 400 head of Hereford cattle, decent stock that should have been thriving on the sparse but adequate grassland. But when I arrived and got my first look at the herd, I noticed they seemed nervous. Cattle have herd behavior that is normally predictable, calm grazing patterns, and established dominance hierarchies. But these animals were skittish and bunched together more than normal, constantly looking toward the western boundary of the property where the fence line separated ranch land from reservation territory. My job was straightforward: morning and evening checks of the herd, repairing fence lines, maintaining water tanks, and keeping an eye out for predators or sick animals that needed treatment. Castellano had two other hands who worked the north section of the ranch, but I was assigned to the western boundary alone because, as he put it, nobody wanted to work that section anymore after what happened to the last guy. When I asked what happened, Castellano went quiet for a moment before saying the previous hand had quit suddenly, claiming he saw things at night that he would not discuss, and that I should just focus on my work and not go wandering around after sunset. The trailer they gave me was old but functional, a 1990s single wide with a propane heater and a bed that sagged in the middle but was better than sleeping in my truck. It sat about half a mile from the western fence line, positioned on a small rise that gave me a view of both the grazing land and the dark expanse of reservation territory beyond the barbed wire. The first few nights were peaceful enough, just the sounds of cattle settling down for the evening and coyotes yipping in the distance, normal ranch noises that I had grown up with during my childhood in rural Colorado. It was on my fifth night, a Wednesday in late June when the temperature had dropped into the 50s after a day that hit 95, that I first noticed something wrong with the cattle. I was sitting outside my trailer around 10 p.m., drinking a beer and watching the stars, when I heard the herd start to move. Not stampeding, but shifting positions all at once in that way cattle do when they sense a predator nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the fence line, where most of the herd had congregated, pressing against the eastern boundary as far from the western fence as they could get while still staying within the grazing area. I swept my flashlight beam across the western fence line and saw nothing unusual, just empty desert and the barbed wire marking the property boundary. But the cattle were clearly agitated, several of them making low distress calls that sounded almost like moaning. I walked the fence line for about 200 yards in each direction, checking for breaks or signs of predator activity. And that is when I found the first dead cow. She was a 3-year-old heifer that had been healthy during my evening check just 2 hours earlier, but now she lay on her side about 30 feet from the fence, with her throat torn open in a wound pattern I had never seen before. The killing was surgical, precise cuts that had opened the major blood vessels in her neck without the tearing and ragged edges you would expect from a coyote or mountain lion attack. The strange part was that nothing had been eaten. Predators kill to eat. They go for the soft tissue and organs first. But this animal had simply been bled out and left where she fell. The ground around her body showed no signs of struggle, no hoof prints indicating she had tried to run or fight, just a small pool of blood that had soaked into the dry soil and was already attracting flies despite the late hour. I called Castellano immediately, waking him up to report the dead animal and describe the unusual wound pattern. His response was not what I expected. Instead of asking questions about predator signs or telling me to drag the carcass away from the herd, he was silent for a long moment before saying, "How far from the western fence?" When I told him about 30 feet, he said something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer or a curse, then told me to leave the body until morning and get back to my trailer. "Do not investigate further tonight," he said, "and make sure all my doors and windows were locked before I went to sleep." Over the next 2 weeks, I found 6 more dead cattle, all killed in the same way, with their throats cut precisely and their bodies left undisturbed by scavengers. The pattern was consistent. They were always within 50 feet of the western fence line, always killed between sunset and midnight, and always with that same surgical precision that no natural predator could achieve. Castellano stopped asking me questions about the deaths and started paying me in cash at the end of each week, handing over $800 bills with a look that suggested he expected me to quit any day. The other ranch hands avoided me during the few times I saw them at the main house, and I overheard one of them tell the other in Spanish that I was working the cursed section, that no amount of money was worth what happened to people who stayed out there too long. I was starting to understand why the position had been available, why Castellano was willing to pay above market rate for basic ranch work, and why the previous hand had quit without explanation. It was on a Friday night in mid-July, exactly 3 weeks after I had started working the ranch, that I finally saw what was killing the cattle. I was doing a late evening check around 9 p.m., driving my ATV along the fence line with a spotlight mounted on the handlebars, when I saw something moving through the herd about 100 yards ahead of me. At first, I thought it was a wolf, a large canine shape moving low to the ground with the stalking posture of a predator. But as I got closer, and my spotlight caught it full on, I realized it was far too large to be any wolf I had ever seen. The thing was the size of a full-grown man, but moving on 4 legs with a gait that looked wrong, limbs bending at angles that did not match canine anatomy. Its fur was patchy and mangy, with bare skin showing through in places that looked gray and diseased in my spotlight beam. The cattle were scattering away from it, but not in panic, almost like they were giving it space out of some instinctive understanding that running would make things worse. When the thing reached a young steer that had gotten separated from the herd, it reared up on its hind legs, and I saw its full shape in silhouette against the darkening sky. It had the body structure of a human standing upright, but the head was all wrong. The skull was elongated and lupine, with a muzzle full of teeth that caught the light when it opened its jaws. What made my stomach drop with visceral horror was that it was wearing clothes, tattered remnants of jeans, and what looked like a flannel shirt that hung open to reveal that patchy fur and gray skin underneath. This was not an animal. This was something that had been human, or was pretending to be human, and the intelligence in its movements as it circled the terrified steer confirmed that whatever I was looking at had human-level awareness. I did something incredibly stupid in that moment, driven by adrenaline and anger at losing so many animals, and maybe a small part of masculine pride that did not want to admit fear. I revved my ATV engine and drove straight at the thing, intending to either hit it or scare it off the property. It turned its head toward me with that too fluid neck movement I had seen before in wildlife documentaries about owls, rotating almost 180 degrees without moving its shoulders. Then it dropped to all fours and started running toward my ATV instead of away from it. The speed was impossible, covering the 100 yards between us in maybe 5 seconds, faster than any wolf or coyote could sprint. I could see its face clearly in my spotlight as it approached, and the detail I will never forget was the eyes. They were not animal eyes, with that reflective tapetum that makes them shine in headlights. They were human eyes, dark and aware, and filled with something that looked like hunger mixed with amusement. Like it found my attempt to chase it off entertaining rather than threatening, I yanked the handlebars hard to the right, trying to avoid a collision, and felt the ATV tilt up on two wheels before slamming back down as I overcorrected. The thing leaped over my vehicle in a jump that should not have been physically possible, clearing the ATV and my head by inches. I felt the displacement of air as it passed over me, smelled something rank and rotten like decay and animal musk, concentrated into a scent so strong it made my eyes water. Then it was behind me, and when I looked back over my shoulder, I saw it standing upright again, watching me with its head cocked to one side in a gesture that looked disturbingly human. It opened its mouth and made a sound I can only describe as my father's voice, calling my name. My father had been dead for 6 years, passed away from lung cancer in 2012, but I heard his voice as clear as if he were standing next to me. "Adam, come here, son. I need to talk to you." The words were perfect, the inflection exactly matching the way my dad used to call me when I was a kid and had stayed out too late. But the voice was coming from that thing's throat, emerging from a mouth full of too many teeth, while those human eyes watched to see if I would respond. I gunned the ATV engine and drove back toward my trailer faster than was safe in the dark, bouncing over rocks and ruts hard enough that I nearly threw myself off the vehicle multiple times. When I reached the trailer, I abandoned the ATV with the engine still running and locked myself inside, pushing the small kitchen table against the door and sitting in the corner with my back against the wall where I could watch both the door and the windows simultaneously. My phone showed no signal, which was normal for this location, and the nearest help was Castellano's main house, 3 miles away across dark open range I was not about to cross on foot. I sat there until dawn, listening to footsteps circle my trailer for hours, heavy boots on gravel that would walk around the perimeter before stopping at my door or windows. Several times I heard scratching on the aluminum siding, long deliberate scrapes that sounded like fingernails or claws being dragged across metal. And twice more I heard my father's voice, asking me to open the door, saying he was cold and needed to come inside. The second time, the voice added details about my childhood that only my father would have known. Specific memories about fishing trips we took when I was 10 years old, proving that whatever was outside had access to my memories or my father's, in ways that violated everything I understood about how reality worked. When the sun finally came up around 6 a.m., I grabbed my truck keys and drove straight to Castellano's house without stopping to pack any of my belongings. I told him I was done, that he could keep the last week's pay and the deposit on the trailer, that I would not spend another night on that property for any amount of money. He nodded like he had expected this exact conversation, walked to his safe, and handed me $1,600 in cash, double what he owed me, without saying a word. As I was leaving, he called after me, "Next time someone warns you about a place, you should listen." I drove back to Farmington and used the money to get a small apartment and a job doing construction work that kept me in town and around people during daylight hours. The ranch shut down 6 months later, Castellano selling off his cattle at a loss and putting the property on the market where it sat unsold for over 2 years before someone from California bought it sight unseen. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the new owners abandoned it after 3 months, citing equipment failures and unexplained livestock deaths that made the operation financially unfeasible. Whatever walks the boundary between that ranch and the reservation land is still there, still hunting, still wearing stolen voices and stolen faces. And somewhere in that trailer I abandoned, my belongings are probably still sitting where I left them, unclaimed because I would rather lose everything I owned than go back to that place after dark and risk hearing my father's voice calling my name from a throat that has nothing human left inside it. I had been driving for 3 days straight from Seattle to Santa Fe in October of 2019, photographing abandoned structures and rural landscapes for a portfolio I was building to pitch to travel magazines. I was 32 years old, freelancing after losing my staff position at a photography studio and living out of my Subaru Forester with my camera equipment and a camping setup that let me avoid hotel costs. The route I had planned would take me through the Four Corners region, which I had never photographed before, and which promised the kind of dramatic desert scenery that editors loved for Western-themed features. The car trouble started around 4 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon as I was driving south on a 2-lane highway that cut through the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona. The temperature gauge started climbing into the red zone, and steam began seeping out from under the hood in wisps that quickly became a thick white cloud. I managed to pull off onto the shoulder before the engine died completely, coasting to a stop on a stretch of empty road that had not seen another vehicle in the 20 minutes since I had passed through the last tiny community. I popped the hood and confirmed what I already suspected from the steam and the sweet smell of antifreeze. The radiator hose had split, spraying coolant all over the engine compartment and leaving me stranded with maybe half a gallon of fluid left in the system. My phone showed 1 bar of signal that flickered in and out, not enough to make a call, but sometimes enough to send a text. I tried messaging my sister in Portland to let her know I was stuck, but the message hung with a spinning wheel that never resolved into delivered. The sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in those golden hour colors that would have been perfect for photography if I were not stuck on the side of a road with no way to drive and no cell service to call for help. I could see maybe 10 miles in every direction, nothing but sagebrush and red rock formations and the occasional juniper tree, twisted by decades of wind. There were no buildings visible, no signs of human habitation except the cracked asphalt road I was stranded on, and a line of wooden power poles marching toward the horizon carrying lines that hummed faintly in the breeze. I decided my best option was to wait until morning and hope that someone would drive by who could give me a lift to the nearest town, or at least let me use their phone to call a tow truck. I had water and food and a sleeping bag, so one night in my car would not kill me, though the temperature was already dropping fast as the sun sank lower. I was organizing my supplies in the back of the Subaru when I noticed someone walking toward me from down the road, approaching from the south. At first, I was relieved to see another person, thinking maybe they lived nearby and could help, or at least tell me how far it was to the next town. But as the figure got closer, maybe 300 yards away, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. The walk was stiff and unnatural, with legs that did not bend quite right at the knees, and the arms swung too far forward and back, with each step like a soldier marching in an exaggerated parade drill. The clothing looked wrong for the region, a formal outfit that might have been a park ranger uniform or maybe a postal worker's getup, but something about the fit seemed off even from a distance. I locked my car doors and watched through the windshield as the figure continued approaching at that same mechanical pace. When it got to maybe 100 yards away, I could see more details that made my throat tighten with instinctive fear. The face was smooth and featureless, like someone had draped beige fabric over a mannequin head, with no visible nose or mouth or even eye sockets, just a blank oval where a face should be. But despite having no eyes, the head was angled directly toward me, tracking my position as it walked closer. I fumbled for my phone and tried to call 911, but the call would not go through, just an error message saying, "No connection available." The figure was 50 yards away now, and I could see that the ranger uniform it wore had no patches or badges, just empty spaces where insignia should have been. The hands hanging at its sides ended in fingers that looked too long, extending several inches past where human fingers should stop. It raised one of those too long hands in a gesture that could have been a wave or a beckoning motion, and I heard something that made me question my sanity. My own voice called out from that faceless thing, saying, "Nora, I need help, please come out." It was my voice exactly, the same pitch and tone I heard on recordings, but there was no mouth moving on that blank face, just sound emanating from where its head was. It knew my name somehow, which should have been impossible because I had not spoken to anyone in hours, and my car had Washington plates that would not tell anyone my first name. The thing kept walking toward my car, now only 30 yards away, and I could hear its footsteps on the asphalt, heavy boots that made clicking sounds with each step. I laid on my horn, blasting it continuously in hopes that the noise would scare it away or attract attention from anyone else who might be in the area. The figure stopped walking when I hit the horn, standing motionless about 20 yards from my driver's side door. We stayed like that for maybe 2 minutes, me with my hand on the horn and this thing standing perfectly still on the road, before it tilted its head to the side at an angle that would have broken a human neck. Then it turned and walked off the road into the desert, not following any path or animal trail, just walking in a straight line through the scrubland and disappearing behind a rock formation. I was shaking so badly that I could barely grip my phone when I saw headlights approaching from the north, the first vehicle I had seen in over an hour. It was a Navajo Nation police truck, white with tribal markings on the door, and it pulled up behind my Subaru with its lights flashing. The officer who got out was maybe in his 40s, wearing a standard police uniform with a name tag that read Cinny, and the look on his face when he saw me was concern mixed with something that looked like knowing resignation. He asked if I was all right, if anyone had approached my vehicle, and the specific way he asked made me think this was not an unusual situation for this stretch of road. I told him about the figure in the ranger uniform with no face, and he nodded slowly before telling me I needed to leave this area immediately, that he would call a tow truck from the next town, but that I should get in his vehicle right now and leave my car where it sat. His tone left no room for argument, and something about the way he kept glancing at the rock formation where the thing had disappeared told me he believed every word I had said. Officer Cinny drove me to a small trading post about 15 miles north, using his radio to arrange for a tow truck to pick up my Subaru and bring it to the town's only mechanic. While we drove, he explained without explaining, using the kind of careful language people use when they are trying to warn you without saying too much. There were things that walked the reservation roads, he said, especially at dusk and after dark. Things that wore shapes that were not their own and tried to lure people out of their vehicles. Most tribal members knew not to stop for anyone they did not recognize, to keep driving even if someone looked injured or in distress, because what looked human was often anything but. He said I was lucky that I had stayed in my car, that others who had gotten out to help what appeared to be stranded motorists or injured people had disappeared or been found days later with no memory of where they had been. The thing I saw was called by a name he said I should not repeat, a Navajo word he refused to translate, but he said it could take many forms, and that recently it had been appearing as authority figures, rangers, and police and postal workers, because people were more likely to trust and approach someone in uniform. The tow truck arrived at the trading post around 7 p.m., and the mechanic who drove it told me he could fix the radiator hose that night if I was willing to pay extra for emergency service. I agreed without haggling, wanting nothing more than to get my car back and get off the reservation before full darkness fell. Officer Cinny waited with me at the trading post, drinking coffee from a vending machine and occasionally glancing out the window at the parking lot as if checking for unwanted visitors. When I got my car back around 10 p.m., with the new radiator hose and fresh coolant, the mechanic handed me back my keys and said something I did not fully understand at the time. He said I should check my car in daylight before I drove too far, that sometimes things left marks or signs that you wanted to know about before you got too isolated again. I thanked him and drove straight through to Gallup, not stopping until I reached a well-lit truck stop with dozens of other vehicles and people. The next morning in the truck stop parking lot, I checked my Subaru like the mechanic had suggested. On the driver's side door and back window, I found muddy handprints that I had not noticed in the dark. They were human-shaped, but wrong in the details, with 6 fingers instead of 5, and prints that showed no ridge patterns or fingerprint whorls, just smooth impressions, as if whatever made them had no skin texture at all. The handprints were on the outside of my windows, but positioned high enough that whatever left them would have had to be over 7 feet tall to reach those spots while standing on the ground. I took photographs of the handprints before washing them off, and I still have those photos saved in a folder I rarely look at because they make me feel the same fear I felt sitting in my car watching that faceless thing walk toward me. I finished my drive to Santa Fe but never went back to the Four Corners region, and I sold my car 6 months later because I could never shake the feeling that something had marked it, that those handprints were some kind of claim or warning that might attract unwanted attention. Officer Sinney's advice has stayed with me ever since. If you break down on reservation roads, stay in your vehicle no matter what approaches. Do not open your door for anyone in uniform unless you called them yourself on a working phone. And if something knows your name but you never told it, drive away as fast as you can and do not look back to see if it follows. I was working as a videographer for an independent documentary production called Four Corners Voices in the fall of 2017, filming interviews with Navajo elders about traditional culture and the challenges facing reservation communities. The project was funded by a small grant from a cultural preservation foundation, and our team consisted of just 3 people, myself handling camera and sound, a director named Marcus, who had some distant Navajo ancestry but had grown up in Los Angeles, and a production assistant named Jen, who mostly dealt with scheduling and equipment logistics. We had been on the reservation for 2 weeks, conducting interviews in various communities and getting some beautiful footage of landscapes and traditional ceremonies that elders had given us permission to film. The trouble started during an interview with a man in his late 70s named Charlie, who lived in a small house outside Shiprock and who had agreed to talk about traditional medicine practices. The interview was going well, with Charlie discussing various herbs and their medicinal uses in careful, thoughtful English, when Marcus made a mistake that I recognized immediately from the way Charlie's expression changed. Marcus asked directly about skinwalkers, using the Navajo word that I had been warned never to say by our cultural liaison on the first day of filming. The moment that word left Marcus's mouth, Charlie stopped talking mid-sentence, stood up, and told us the interview was over. He said something in Navajo that sounded like a prayer or a protection chant, then looked directly at me and said in English, "You should not have spoken that word. They hear when you call them. They know when you are curious." Marcus tried to apologize, explaining that we were just trying to understand all aspects of Navajo culture for the documentary, but Charlie shook his head and asked us to leave his property immediately. As we were packing up our equipment, he pulled me aside and said something that has stayed with me. "Do not talk about them, especially not on this land. What you speak about, you invite. What you film, you carry with you." We drove back to the motel in Shiprock where we had been staying, a cheap place called the Desert Rose Inn that catered mostly to oilfield workers and the occasional tourist. My room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot and a stretch of empty desert beyond the property fence. That night, around 11 p.m., I was reviewing footage on my laptop when I heard something tapping on my window. Just a light, rhythmic tap, tap, tap that could have been a branch, except there were no trees near the building. I pulled back the curtain and saw nothing except darkness and the orange glow of the parking lot lights below. The tapping started again a few minutes later, more insistent this time, and when I opened the curtain, I saw a face pressed against the glass. It was my face, my exact face, staring in at me from outside my 2nd-story window with an expression I had never seen myself make. The eyes were too wide. The mouth stretched in something between a smile and a grimace, and the head was cocked at an angle that looked like a dog trying to understand human speech. I stumbled backward from the window, knocking over my laptop in the process, and by the time I looked again, the face was gone. I grabbed my phone and called Marcus's room, 2 doors down from mine, and told him something was outside my window. He He thought I was overreacting to being spooked by the day's events, but agreed to come check. When he arrived, we both looked out my window and saw nothing unusual, just the empty parking lot and the dark desert beyond. But then Marcus pointed at something on the glass that made my blood run cold. There were handprints on the outside of my window, pressed against the glass from fingers that left greasy smears. The prints were human-sized but positioned so high on the window that whatever made them would have had to be standing on something, except there was no ledge or balcony outside my second-floor room, just a straight wall that dropped to the parking lot below. Marcus took photos of the handprints with his phone, and we called the front desk to report a possible prowler or someone on the roof accessing windows. The night manager, an older Navajo woman named Ruth, came up to look and went pale when she saw the prints. She made a phone call in Navajo, speaking rapidly to someone, and within 15 minutes 2 men arrived who she introduced as her cousins. They examined the window, talked with Ruth in Navajo while glancing at me with expressions that mixed concern and something that looked like disappointment. And then one of them told me I needed to move to a different room immediately, preferably on the first floor with the curtains closed. Ruth explained that whatever was outside my window had marked me, that it had somehow created a connection by copying my face and leaving its prints on my window. The correct thing to do, according to her cousins, who apparently dealt with these situations before, was to avoid that room and not acknowledge what I had seen by talking about it further. They performed what looked like a blessing ritual, burning something that smelled like sage and cedar while speaking in Navajo, and Ruth insisted on moving me to a ground floor room at no extra charge. The rest of that night passed without incident, but I did not sleep. Just sat in the corner of my new room with all the lights on and my back against the wall. In the morning, Marcus and Jen and I had a discussion about whether to continue the documentary. Jen wanted to leave immediately, saying the whole thing felt cursed, and she did not care about losing the grant money. Marcus wanted to push forward, arguing that we only had 3 more days of scheduled interviews and that abandoning the project over what he called superstitious reactions was unprofessional. I was somewhere in the middle, scared by what had happened, but also reluctant to waste 2 weeks of work. We compromised by agreeing to finish our scheduled interviews, but to avoid any topics related to witchcraft or supernatural elements of Navajo culture. The next 3 days were tense, with all of us jumping at small noises and constantly checking over our shoulders. We completed 2 more interviews with elders who were gracious and patient with our questions about traditional crafts and language preservation. Nobody mentioned the incident at the motel, and everything seemed like it would be fine until our last night on the reservation. We were packing up equipment in Marcus's room around 9 p.m., getting ready for an early morning departure the next day, when Jen noticed something on the window. It was the same handprints, greasy smears, positioned high on the glass from the outside, even though we were on the first floor now and Jen had been in the room all evening with the door locked. Marcus pulled out his phone to take photos, but when he tried, the camera app crashed repeatedly. My phone did the same thing, as did Jen's, all 3 of our devices suddenly unable to take pictures despite working fine moments before. We left that night instead of waiting until morning, throwing our equipment and luggage into our rental van and driving to Farmington, where we checked into a chain hotel near the interstate. Nobody slept much, and in the morning when we reviewed our footage from the 2 weeks of filming, we discovered something disturbing. In multiple shots where we had been filming interviews or landscape footage, there were shapes visible in the background that we had not noticed during filming. Dark figures standing far off but visible if you looked closely, always positioned at the edge of the frame, always facing toward our camera. When we tried to zoom in digitally on these figures, the video quality degraded to the point of being unwatchable, pixelating, and distorting in ways that should not happen with properly exposed footage. Marcus wanted to use the footage anyway, arguing that the mysterious figures would add authenticity and atmosphere to the documentary. Jen and I both refused, and after a heated argument, we agreed to delete everything and return the grant money with an explanation that the project had encountered unforeseen production difficulties. Marcus was furious and accused us of sabotaging his career, but I could not shake the feeling that keeping that footage would be inviting something into our lives that we did not want to deal with. I got a call 6 months later from Ruth, the motel manager in Shiprock. She had gotten my number from the reservation we had made under the production company name. She said she felt obligated to tell me that Marcus had returned to the area alone, trying to film additional footage for the documentary despite our agreement to abandon it. He had checked into the Desert Rose Inn again and requested the same second-floor room where I had my experience. Ruth had tried to refuse, but Marcus insisted and used some complaints about discrimination to pressure her into allowing it. 3 days into his stay, he checked out suddenly in the middle of the night, leaving most of his equipment behind and driving away so fast he left tire marks in the parking lot. When Ruth went to clean his room, she found all of his camera equipment smashed as if someone had taken a hammer to it, memory cards broken into pieces and scattered across the floor. On every window and mirror in the room, there were handprints, dozens of them overlapping and smeared like someone had been pressing hands against every reflective surface repeatedly. The curtains had been torn down, and on the wall, in what looked like motor oil or something dark and sticky, someone had written "stop" over and over in letters that got progressively more erratic and unreadable. Ruth said Marcus had called her once from a Las Vegas phone number, asking questions about cleansing rituals and whether there was a way to break a connection with something from the reservation. She gave him contact information for a medicine man she knew, but she never heard from Marcus again, and his phone number stopped working shortly after. The documentary was never completed. The Grant Foundation wrote off the project as a loss, and Jen and I both moved on to different careers that did not involve filming on tribal lands. I destroyed all my copies of the footage we had taken, wiped my hard drives, and broke the physical discs into pieces before throwing them away. Whatever we had invited by speaking that word during Charlie's interview, whatever had marked me and followed Marcus, I wanted no connection to it remaining in my possession. Sometimes late at night, I still check my windows before closing the curtains, making sure there are no faces looking in and no handprints on the glass that should not be there.